Hi there, it's Colin Jones here. I'm speaking to you in a condition of lockdown from London. I imagine you are in lockdown in some respect as well, and wherever you are, we're all in lockdown. And in fact, the subject of my talk this afternoon is an 85-year-old woman in a sort of lockdown in the center of French Revolutionary Paris. And the cause of that lockdown is it's not a coronavirus like us, but it is, in fact, in her view, the French Revolution or Jacobinism that she saw as a form of contagion quite as deadly as we now see COVID-19. So she lives absolutely towards the end of her life in the center of Paris. Strange place you may think, and we'll come back to it, for a counter-revolutionary and wannabe émigré to end up. But she's absolutely at the heart of Paris in her private mansion, a mansion that faces onto the Place du Carrousel that you can see there in the map, really between the Louvre and the Tuileries palaces. And across the square from her house, her mansion, is the convention hall, of course, in the Tuileries Palace, the offices of the Committee of Public Safety. Towards the end of the northern end of the Tuileries Palace is the Hôtel de Brionne, which houses the Committee of General Security. And indeed, the former owners of that hotel were the Brionne family, who are relatives of whom are off fighting the French Revolution in the Army of the Princes. Along the Rue Saint-Honoré, just a little few hundred yards, is of course the Jacobin Club, the former Jacobin monastery in which Our Lady actually had a private chapel. I can't believe she visited it during the Terror. But the place itself, onto which her hotel looks out, was in 1792 to 1793 the site of capital execution. If she chose, out of her window, she could see guillotinings. I imagine she didn't choose to. If she was in a sort of grandstand seat for terror, a neighboring palace, for example, it's the one right at the heart of to the east of the Place du Carrousel there, was actually hit by shrapnel in the struggle and for the storming of the Tuileries Palace on the 10th of August, 1792. So this is someone who is, as I say, a counter-revolutionary, a wannabe émigré, who's absolutely in the belly of the beast. And in the belly of the beast, in her private mansion, she took that refuge of all lockdown victims, surely, which is that she wrote. And her writing presents us with a chronicle of detestation of the revolution whose lair she was there inhabiting. So this is a very unusual document we're looking at, maybe original, that we're bringing to this session on the texts and letters of the French Revolution. It's almost entirely unknown. It was actually read and consulted by one of her descendants in the early 20th century, who was writing a sort of genealogical history of the family, and he provided some extracts. Apart from that, I honestly don't think anyone has ever really much looked at it, where it lies in the personal dossier for her, in the F7, the General Police Archives, within the Archives Nationales. It's there that I found it a couple of years ago. So I've been working on this in collaboration with a team for a year or two now. It's research that's made possible by a research grant from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. The main output from our project is going to be an edition of the letters in French, but the text in French probably will do the commentary in English. So I'm the principal investigator of the project, to use the jargon. My postdoc research assistant working on it is Dr. Simon MacDonald. His is the work of transcription and a lot of the editing work which we've done so far. And we're also working with our co-investigator, Dr. Alex Fairfax Chumley, down in Exeter University. And there he has established a website, which you can see the reference to here, on which we're going to be putting translations of some of the juicier extracts from the letters. And there's a blog going there, so please feel free to consult that. And today is very much a joint effort of this team that I'm presenting. So what I want to do very briefly really today is give you a sort of overview of the document. Starting first, I'll look at the person itself, the revolutionary Duchess that we're going to be, whose work this is. Secondly, we'll look at the form that the documentation takes. Thirdly, we'll look at briefly at what she witnessed, the reportage aspect of this document. And then finally, we'll look at her politics. So we are talking about, as you can see, the life and the letters of Innocente Catherine de Rugy de Plessis-Bellière, towards the end of her life, Duchesse d'Elbeuf. In 1793, she went to her local section to get a certificat de résidence, and you can see on the right there that it noted that she was 4 foot 10 inches high. Actually, in our own terms, that would be about 5 feet, and give a totally average type of description, physiognomic description of what she had. Nothing really to make her stand out. Dark eyes, I guess, would be the only thing. And indeed, those dark eyes had seemed quite a lot. We know that when she was presented at Versailles in the late 1740s, early 1750s, it was commented that she was lame, she was boiteuse. So she was born in 1707, so was well over 80 at the time of the French Revolution, born to a middling Breton sword noble family. Her father's the Marquis de Rudé de Plessis-Bellière, and as a result of a series of adventitious legacies from within the family and 2 very advantageous marriages, she's at the end of her life one of the a really exceptionally wealthy woman. In 1729, she marries, her first marriage is to another Breton noble, the Marquis de Coët-Farneau. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. But the marriage ends in 1744 with his death. They have not produced any children. She will be, all her life, she will be childless. A couple of years later, she marries Emmanuel Maurice de Lorraine, then known as the Prince d'Elbeuf, the Prince of Elbeuf. The following year, in 1748, his childless elder brother, who is the Duc d'Elbeuf, dies, which means the Prince becomes the Duke of Elbeuf, and she obviously then becomes the Duchesse d'Elbeuf. Just a thing to say about the family, just to give you a sense of the status of this woman, by reason of direct descent from the 15th century Dukes of Lorraine, at the time when Lorraine was an independent sovereign house, Emmanuel Maurice, as the Duke of Elbeuf, can claim to be a prince étranger. That's a sort of a foreign prince, which is, and she herself, princesse étrangère. The princes étrangers are the highest rung on the aristocratic ladder, only really one down from the Prince du Sang, the princes of the blood, situated therefore right at the top, sort of creme de la creme of the very prestigious dukes and peers, the Duc et Père. So this is someone who is really, really up in the status ladder of the Ancien Regime. And you can see on the, I've done a close-up there from the Turgot map. At the top of the picture, you can see the Hôtel de Créqui. Well, that is where she lives. She and her husband move in there in the early 1750s. She does a complete makeover, it mainly done, financed by her own money, we know. And she stays there. Her husband will die in 1763. And from 1763 down to the revolution, she lives there, although she does also divide her time with some of her provincial chateaux, the most important of which is in Picardy, the chateau at Moreuil, which we'll talk about in a minute. We know next to nothing about her pre-1789 experience. It's in 1788 that her letters begin. So let's look at the document. The document is in her own hand, behind her signature there. You can see an example of it. And I think I'm not revealing anything striking when I say that her handwriting is really, really terrible. And it's been a fantastic challenge, to which Simon MacDonald, the postdoc on the project, has risen rather magnificently, just to suss out what she is actually saying. Also, although she is actually an incredibly interesting, intelligent, and very astute woman, as is par for the course for all women, even duchesses in the 18th century, everything about the way she writes, not just her handwriting, but her grammar, her syntax, her spelling, absolutely appalling, absolutely appalling. So we have to take that into account. And obviously we're thinking about how we modernize the text. So what the form of this document takes is 6 densely written notebooks, which contain what purport to be letters, or must be copies of letters then. In the period 88 to 94, there are about 70 of them, and they average about 1,000 words each. So we've got a text totally of about 75 to 80,000 with other stuff as well. All of them are addressed to an unnamed lady acquaintance, seemingly of the same sort of status, Madame, she's always referred to. Of course, we have no replies that are extant at all. And as this format suggests, the letters may in fact be copies of letters sent out. And so obviously that raises questions of possible self-editing and when it was edited, all that sort of stuff. But we also have to face the real possibility that these letters were not really letters at all, but really a sort of letter form over some sort of essentially a diary type of a document to what might even be an imagined or imaginary correspondent. And it's interesting that when this document came into the hands of the Committee of General Security, which was in the early 1794, the agent who processed the document said he wasn't sure whether there was a correspondent or whether the correspondent was in fact imaginary. He also noted, incidentally, that this letter series, for which we have 1788 to 94, actually went back to 1738. He then proceeded, I think, to chuck 50 years of this document into the nearest dustbin, which is a great tragedy for us all. So, suppose these are copies of letters. Are the letters really sent? I mean, the last couple of years of her life, there we are, she's in Paris, the heart of Paris, at the heart of the terror. You would think, well, it was implausible with police surveillance over the mail, etc., for the letters ever to get out, and they'd be, very incriminating for her and the person to whom they were addressed. On the other hand, it's pretty implausible that someone should be living 100 yards from the Committee of General Security and the Committee of Public Safety and writing a document like this. So, the jury's out still on this, if you like. Were they, however, a literary construct? And, that is something which is interesting us as well, the extent to which they're sort of following literary models. We actually thought maybe we could see something through closer perusal of Madame de Sévigné, because we know that her letters are used as a model across the 18th century. And we also then look at the literature of sensibility, the epistolary novel, etc., etc. There isn't actually very much sensibility or affect in the letters, however. Certainly by the end, particularly the last year or so of her life, year and a half or so, the document becomes much more religious, much more spiritually orientated. And I think that does recall for us the origins of the ego document of the 18th century, whether it's the autobiography or the epistolary novel, of spiritual autobiography, which is a commonplace within post-Tridentine piety, and that has some sort of affinity, I think, with the sort of thing that she's doing by the end of her life. On the other hand, there's a lot of just straight report. I mean, I think that's why it will be most of interest to historians, for its function of reportage, of keeping someone in the know about what's going on in the politics of the capital. And I think that format of a sort of letter to a provincial friend, it's very common. I was actually thinking it back to the 17th century with Pascal and the Lettres Provinciales, but you can also look at certain things that are occurring in the Fronde, where another period of high, intense political activity. We also think that there are some similarities to those Nouvelles à la main, which are reproducing particularly literary and cultural, but also political news from the capital, and which are being circulated in manuscript form before 1789. So there's a whole set of issues to do with the genre, the ontology of the document itself, which we're puzzling over, and that's something which we could perhaps talk about in the discussion. I'm going to go on and think now about the letters as reportage. It's a sort of set of accounts, really, of her and her revolution. She is, as I say, an émigré in one sense, in that As soon as the revolution occurs, she's off. Like the Comte d'Artois, almost the day after the storming of the Bastille, which she is appalled at, she heads out of Paris. But unlike the Comte d'Artois, who goes abroad, she actually heads for her provincial chateau at Morée. And although she comes back to Paris a few times between 78-9 and 91, she's essentially most of that period, that first period, spent in Morée. It's actually very interesting, although she keeps a running commentary on the politics of the revolution, she also gives a sense of what it was like to be a noble woman in the provinces, in Picardy, moreover, which is very turbulent. The peasantry are very turbulent at this period. In fact, it's only a few kilometers from her chateau to the town of Rouen, where in 1790-91, Gracchus Babeuf is living and agitating and publishing and all the rest of it. Also, we should note that in August 1790, she more or less faces down a peasant revolt in her own, faces it down in her own chateau courtyard with threats of stringing her up, threats to her life being echoed around her. She's a very sprightly but also very doughty and dauntless person. By late 1791, it's clear she's considering quite seriously emigration, proper emigration, getting out of France. I think that's partly to do with her experiences in the provinces. She's got this sense that those loyal vassals who are also forelock tugging her before 1789 have suddenly turned into a sort of load of entitled, sort of ungrateful plebs. She doesn't like the sort of social atmosphere. She feels threatened there. But I think also there's a political reason. She's more or less at the period, and I'll talk about this in a minute, giving up on the king, giving up on Louis, and instead looking to the émigré princes, the army of the princes, which is being formed over the border in the Austrian Netherlands. The wish, therefore, to come back not just to Paris, but to actually leave the country, and she does that in late 1791. She crosses just over the border, actually not very far from Lille, actually just a matter of kilometers really, to the small town of Tournai. And there's a big émigré community there. She travels seemingly to Brussels, where she is received by the Archduchess, who actually of the Austrian Netherlands, who actually is very polite to her, and actually she does have an affinity, a family affinity with her. They're all from the Lorraine branch. But actually her comments on the experience among this noble community, this aristocratic émigré community in Tournai, where she's only a few months, is actually incredibly interesting. And it's recalls to me, having read it, the way that Chateaubriand writes about the emigration a year or so later, not actually in Tournai, but a bit further to the east. All these nobles are piled up there, and they're all stony broke. There's just no money. They're sort of cut off from their wealth. They're cut off from their life, and they're completely dependent on handouts, on the charity, sometimes of the local aristocracy and the government in the Austrian Netherlands, often of the princes. In fact, the princes are making a lot of donations. And she's feeling uncomfortable in that atmosphere. And also, this is a moment in turn of the year when in the National Assembly there are threats starting to be voiced about the émigré, legislation against them, threatening the nationalization of their property. And so in March 1792, she cuts and runs back. The threat of expropriation, I think, is absolutely vital for her. It means she would have absolutely no income to spend her time away from her home. Interesting, I think, as I said at the beginning, that she chooses not to go back to Morée, where she had to fight off those ungrateful peasants a few months earlier. Tournai actually becomes also itself overrun by Dumouriez and the French Revolutionary Army shortly after, so that's nowhere. She can't go there. And she chooses Paris. Paris is the place for this aristocrat wannabe émigré, which is, for that moment, to borrow from Hilary Mantel, a place of greater safety. Maybe it's the anonymity that she hopes to get there. Maybe it's the contact she has. We don't know. But she basically will go there, and she will live the rest of her life down to her death in 1794 in January in Paris. Very much, what she describes under the cosh, but also observing closely, first the overthrow of the king, which is very interesting, which takes place literally on her doorstep, and then the build-up of terror as it increasingly impinges on the life of her and those few of her friends and close family and friends who are still remaining in Paris. She's therefore witness to the revolution, and an incredibly interesting, very intelligent, over 80, she's got fully in control of all her marbles, I would say, more than that actually. But I witnessed to the revolution, a commentator on the revolution, not particularly, however, slightly disappointingly, an eyewitness person. She does get around, we know that, within Paris, but she's over 80, she doesn't get around that much, I don't think. And we get the sense from her letters that she's depending on some paper sources, newspapers she clearly reads. She reads the counter-revolutionary press earlier on. That's not there anymore after when she's returned, really. But she reads she knows what's going on in the National Assembly. She reads the papers of record. Plus, I think she has some friends, some family still around. By the end, they're all sort of hiding in their hotels, not going out, obviously. But I think probably the people she lives with, and particularly her servants, and she'll have a big service class working under her, are probably the people giving her information. And you do get a sense it's not her eyes that are witnessing, but she's recording secondhand things which are going on and have been seen by someone to whom she has spoken or from whom she has the information. As time goes on, this witness becomes increasingly turning to religion, turning inwards. She continues her commentary on what's going on outside, but there's a greater interest and greater sort of amount of time spent writing about religion. And I said I was going to go on and in the final section just talk about politics. Well, that's the clue, really. I mean, essentially, her politics are her religion as well. She sees the revolution from the word go as essentially insubordination, not just of the royal order, but of the divine order. So for her, the king is, as the term she uses a lot, the Lord's anointed, le loin du Seigneur. But, and this is, I think, perhaps one of the interesting things about her letters, she is no great fan. She is actually not a fan of divine right absolutism. And I've been trying to sort of get an angle on her, get a sort of sense of where her politics is coming from. And my provisional conclusion, which I'll be interested to hear what people think, is that basically she's an old-style dévot. I know this term dévot is used in the early part of the revolution when the revolutionists are talking about someone who doesn't accept the civil constitution of the clergy, a superstitious old woman is, sort of the very rude way of thinking about it. But she is like that, I guess, but she is totally against the civil constitution of the clergy. But she is actually a dévot in the old style, in the style of the parti dévot. The Parti dévot, which was very much part of politics under the Ancien Regime. And it was there, the Parti dévot, at the royal court, it was there in the parliament, it's there in the structures of government, it's there in the church, obviously, it's there out there in the public sphere. So we've got, I think what we've got here is the view of a high-class dévot. And dévot, as in, the way in which it's been used under the Ancien Regime, way back to the times of Richelieu and Mazarin, but have continued through the 18th century with the Jesuit versus Jansenist struggles. It's that sort of dévot that we're talking about, grounded in a very deep personal devotion. I don't think there's any, sort of gainsaying that. She is clearly very devoted, very spiritually motivated, mobilized sort of person. A belief certainly in the social order as God given, but not the social order with the king in charge. In fact, her support of the crown is actually very, very conditional. She is not in favor of the monarchy, the raison d'etat monarchy established by Richelieu, Mazarin, and Louis XIV. What she sees as the basis of the Ancien Regime constitution is the society of orders, of which, of course, she is absolutely at the apex. And in fact, she does a sort of paean in praise of the dukes and peers that she says, you know, she maintains as the sort of basis of all that's good and true in the French nation. So society of orders, with the nobility being the sort of principal support of the monarchy, and the idea of a monarchy which is based on that rather than on the personal power of the crown. Plus, of course, and this springs or develops from her own spirituality, an ultramontane commitment to the international Catholicism and the role of the papacy. From this position, and this is the thing that I think will surprise people who read the document, she's incredibly critical of Louis XVI, incredibly critical of the king. Ce roi enfant, you know, this childish king. You know, at some stages in 1790, 1789, 1991, she's saying to Louis XVI, you know, man up, get on a horse, you know, act the part, you know, be a king for heaven's sake. See where your interest lies. You have that interest to be supported by the ancient aristocracy. But her problem is, no, the king is too much committed to the third estate. He's led astray initially by Necker, then by, you know, by himself actually, and others in his entourage, and he denies a sort of interest and commitment to his ancient nobility. So a very critical voice going through 1789, 1991. By the end of 91, as I suggested earlier, she sort of gives up on him. And she looks then to the émigré princes to re-establish the monarchy. The king's not going to do it. It's got to be the émigré princes. And for a moment, she's really very confident about the strength of the émigré armies and the solidity of their linkages with foreign powers. And in July 1792, we find ourselves saying, well, you know, the King of Prussia will mobilize in a matter of weeks, and he'll be at Paris in a couple of weeks. It'll be a cakewalk. It'll be straight in. By autumn, of course, she's totally disenchanted. The King of Prussia has played what she calls a jeu de roi, you know, a kingly game to withdraw allegedly for money, she claims. The émigrés turn out to be very, very weak. And actually, interestingly, she pays tribute to the strength of the revolutionary armies after being initially very hostile to them, the strength in actually driving out the émigrés and the Allied forces. From that moment, as I say, there's a sort of political disengagement which goes together with a growing commitment to her spiritual state. In some ways, she's giving up hope in some ways of any speedy reversal of overthrow of the revolution, and is looking to prayer rather than hope to bring any consultation. In this period, there is still a continuing, actually fascinating reportage going on. As you find, she's increasingly locked down. All her friends are sort of staying in their home. She can't really go out herself. And she writes, as I say, she's a lockdown kid. You know, she writes and she writes and she writes. And then in 1794, it comes very swiftly to an end. She is denounced. She's denounced by someone within the Section de la Montagne, which is next to her, the Tuileries section. Tuileries section, Revolutionary Committee, goes round to her house, arrests her, actually doesn't take her to prison, places her in under household arrest, but she's in custody there. And therefore in essentially solitary confinement, spared, I think, from prison by her old age, probably. And her documents are found, her letter series, these cahiers are found. They're put away in a desk which is locked and placed under seal. Seemingly, she is in a situation, as I say, of total lockdown. That's from January. February, she dies. Leaving her letters for the police authorities and 2 centuries on for a few historians to puzzle over. And one wonders, you know, in those circumstances, whether those diaries had not been serving some sort of existential function for her, which she'd allegedly been maintaining since 1738 after them. Without them, it seems it's as if life had no meaning, or not the meaning that she wanted to take after it. And so in some ways, looking at these documents, we feel we're in the presence of a set of letters, a diary, or whatever it is, an ego document of some description, which serves a very deep existential function. And I think we could all understand this. You know, we're in lockdown. if we were alone, if we were cut off from our loved ones, if we lost a connection to the internet, for example, would life be worth going on living? And I'll end there.